I want to say something before I start. This episode is different from the three that came before it. The houses I've told you about, the one on Patterson, the co-worker's home, Mary's house, those were places my family rented or places my fiance and I chose. The building I'm going to tell you about now was not a choice. We went there because we needed somewhere safe to go. My mother, my much younger sister, and me. It was the late 1990s, and we were at a domestic violence shelter. I'm not going to tell you the name of the organization, or the city, or even the street. That information is not mine to share, and I wouldn't share it regardless. What I am going to tell you is what the building was, what had been in it before us, and what we found still living there. I have been careful with the story. I've sat with it for a long time before deciding to tell it here. Because the women and children in that building, the ones there at the same time as us, the ones there before us, the ones there after, they were carrying things that had nothing to do with the paranormal. They were just surviving. And I want to hold that in the room while I tell you the rest of this. The hauntings I experienced in that place were real, but they were not the most important things happening in those walls. And I want you to hold both things at once. And I'll try to help you do that. The building had been a senior citizens assisted living facility before it became a shelter. I don't know how long it had operated as one or when it transitioned. What I know is that by the time we arrived, it still held the physical remnants of its previous life. And that was in the basement. Down in the basement, stored and waiting, were the things the residents had left behind or that the facility had kept after it closed. Canes, walkers, and wheelchairs. I want you to think about what it means to stand in a basement surrounded by mobility aids that belonged to people who no longer needed them. And it's not because they recovered, but because they died or just moved out of the facility. Those objects, the walkers, the canes, the wheelchairs, were the last things those people touched on their way out of the world. And they were still in this place, stacked in the basement, in a building that had since become a place where women and children in crisis tried to rebuild their lives. That is the foundation of this story, literally. That is what was underneath everything in the dark below our feet. The basement had an exercise bike down there, and in the laundry room. Women used both. Most of them did not like going down there, and a few of them could have told you exactly why. And I could have told them, but I didn't. I want to describe the building as it functioned because context matters for everything that follows. There was an overnight residential manager, staff whose job it was to move through the building after dark, checking on residents, making sure everyone was accounted for, either in their rooms or in the common areas. The TV rooms, the hallways, a quiet routine check. The sound of someone making their rounds. And she was a student at a university that was maybe 3 or 4 miles from the shelter. I'm not sure what her major was, but I do remember that she wore braces. And I was thinking it was strange that an adult would wear braces, but I've seen adults since wearing braces, so that's no longer a surprise to me. Anyway, you would hear her footsteps as she made her rounds, and she would always open the doors to the rooms and, to make sure we were accounted for. Just a purposeful, measured pace through the corridors of the shelter. And she had, I think, 2 floors to check on. And there was an attic, but she never went up there. And after what we went through there, I don't blame her. There was also a cook, but she was there during the daytime, an elderly woman whose name I no longer remember. She worked in the kitchen and the dining room, preparing meals, going about the ordinary business of feeding people. And she felt consistently that something was watching her from the dining room as she worked. She told me and my mother that person. I mean, we walked in one day, to get a snack after we had gone out looking for jobs. And I was trying to get back into school at that time, but I don't think I made it. I just gave up. And when we came in, she jumped, and she said we scared her, and she said she had already thought that someone was had come in, and she spoke to them, but there was no one there. Something in the room that was aware of her. It had no intention of making itself useful. And it was just like a surprise. But I really wasn't that surprised, because I felt like that throughout the entire building. I just felt like something was in there watching us. The residents reported feeling watched in the bathrooms and showers. And I did not like using these, places. I really didn't. I hated to go in there, but my hygiene demanded it. I had to have a shower every day, but I was afraid to go in there by myself because I thought, I don't know what I thought. I was afraid. And, that particular discomfort, the sense of an unseen presence in a space meant for privacy and for safety and for the simplest human dignity, was something multiple residents mentioned. A lot of them did, even the children. A lot of them were afraid to go in there by themselves. And this was in a shelter for women and children who had survived violence, because one woman was almost murdered by her partner. He was actually in jail for attempted murder. And, the feeling of being watched without consent is not a minor thing. I want to name that directly. It was one more layer of violation in a building full of women and kids who had already endured enough of those. I started going down to the basement to use the exercise bike. I wanted something to do, something physical. It was there. And, no one else was really taking advantage of it. And I, allowed to use it. Especially when other people were down there doing the laundry, like my mom. I would go down there and just hop on the bike. It wasn't an expensive bike. It was just an old bike. It looked like a regular bike that you would ride on the street, but it was stationary. That's how old it was. And I guess it had been donated, like a lot of things, which the women, the staff members, would actually go through and take themselves before giving to the residents. And, yeah, thank you, United Way. But anyway, the first few times were okay, or okay enough. The basement was exactly what a basement in a building like that would be. Rather dim, utilitarian, full of the stored things and no one that bothered to move. The walkers, wheelchairs, and canes were in their one section, and the laundry machines were in another. And the exercise bike was sort of between the two. And, gradually, I started, to feel like something was down there with me. Not just any, a specific thing, not a sound or a shape or, anything like that. Just the certainty, and it built up slowly over multiple visits down to the basement. And I finally realized I was just not alone down there, even though I thought I was, or hoped I was. Something in that basement was aware of me. It had been aware of me since before I came down the stairs. And I kept going back for a while because I wanted to exercise. I wanted to lose weight. And I told myself it was the atmosphere of the building, the stored belongings, my own imagination, running on the particular fuel of everything I'd already experienced in my life in other haunted spaces. And, I was good at telling myself these things. But eventually I stopped going. I just couldn't make myself go back down there. And I'm not sure why, but one day I was down there, just like pedaling along, and I just stopped. And I just jumped off the bike and I went barreling up the stairs. And I felt better as soon as I was away from the basement. And I hated it. I hated to go down there. I would go down there with my mom. But, I wouldn't go down there by myself after that. I just couldn't. And the women who did their laundry down there, they understood. Because none of them liked it either. They went because they had to, and they came back upstairs as quickly as they could. But one woman who was from another, town in our state, she refused to go down there by herself. She would beg other women to go down there with her so she could put her laundry in the machine and then, put it in the dryer and then go and get it later. Nobody lingered in that basement. No one, not even staff, but the resident manager at night, she would go down there because she had to check the entire building and make sure all the was as it should be. Everything was locked and whatever. And my mother asked her, "You're not scared to go down there by yourself?" And she said, "No." I'm like, wow, nerves of steel. She would probably ascend Yosemite using those steel cables, or even hike Angel's Landing. I mean, she's into that sort of thing. I wouldn't, but that's just me. That basement was as scary as hiking, something like Mount Everest or something to me. The things in the dark down there were patient. They had nowhere else to be. And to be honest, I don't believe they were the spirits of the former residents. I believe it was something demonic. The overnight manager made her rounds. I've already told you that. Put steps in the corridor, around 9-ish, I guess. Measured pace, and you sound of someone checking on the building and the people in it. You would hear keys jangling. But one time, the rounds happened when the overnight manager was not making them. There were the footsteps in the hall and the sound of something moving through the building with purpose, with the particular rhythm of someone who knows the space and has walked it many times. But underneath the footsteps, a cane. The sound of a cane on the floor, tap by tap, accompanying the walk. Yet there was no one there. And I remember this very well because I was sitting in the bed, sitting up reading. I'm not sure what I was reading. It was some book. I just don't remember what it was. It might have been the Gilda Radner autobiography. It was so sad. It was so sad because I remember Gene Wilder left a little afternote because he had found her journals and everything after she had passed, and that's what this book was based on. It was her life story, and she was trying so hard to live because she was trying the macrobiotic diet and everything to beat the cancer that eventually took her life. But it was probably that book I was reading, and my door opened, but I didn't see anything, and it just shut. As soon as I looked, it just like slammed shut. I jumped up and opened it, and I didn't see anyone in the hallway. And I jumped back in the bed, and I was like, what the heck? What is that? And, even my mother said something about it, and my sister was so scared. She was 18 years younger than I am, so she was like a kid, and I was really grown, but they allowed me to be there because, I was, with my mom when she was in that situation, and it was just scary. It was really freaky, and all the other women experienced it too. One of them was even in the bathroom, and she said she actually heard it go by, and she jumped because she didn't have the bathroom door shut. She thought maybe it was one of the little boys running around and or something, and there was nothing out there. And it was just creepy. I have thought about this more than almost anything else in that building because whoever that was or whatever that was, it had learned the building. It knew the pattern of the overnight checks. It replicated them. It walked the halls the way a person walks when they're responsible for the people sleeping behind those doors. Or it had been doing this for years before the shelter existed, when this was still an assisted living facility, when the people in those rooms are old and fragile and needed checking on, when the cane it walked with was not a supernatural detail, but simply the way it moved through the world. And that something had stayed, something that used to live in that building had never left. It was still making the rounds. My mother was in one of the TV rooms one evening, and hardly anyone was there. Like, some women work second shift. They didn't want you working third shift, because they wanted you to be there. They wanted the place locked up, at night. Anyway, she was in there by herself watching television, one of those Lifetime movies she liked, or maybe it was a movie of the week. It was just an ordinary evening, very, quiet. I hardly watched TV. I had never been into TV back then because they didn't have all that, the stuff they have on now, like the first 48 ID and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And then I got into those paranormal shows, which I'll talk about later. So my mom, she looked up toward the doorway because she thought one of the other residents had come to the door. Because there was one resident, she would sometimes come up there and watch TV with my mom or come down because she was on the second floor and we were on the first. And, my mom glanced up the way you do when you feel a presence at the edge of your, vision. And she expected to see a person there, but there was no one there. And she told me about it afterward. I'm not sure she told my sisters. My sister would have been plumb scared. And, my mom is, she's frightened. She's frightened about some things, but back then she did not really believe in that stuff. You didn't really see those shows on television. In fact, my mom was watching Ghost Hunters before I even knew what it was. My mom, she's not someone who's given to dramatic interpretation. She looked up, she expected a person, she saw no one. She told me because she knew by that point in our time in that building that I would understand what she was talking about. And then it was the night someone else heard it in the hallway. And this other resident heard something in the hall outside her room after dark, just moving, coming down the corridor. And sound was not footsteps alone. It was the sound of something being dragged or someone walking with a walker, lifting and placing it, the particular rhythmic sound of assisted movement, or dragging a leg or something. She couldn't really say exactly. What she said was that it was slow and it was deliberate and moved past her door and continued down the hall and then it was gone. And believe me, she locked her door. And she locked it. And if you locked your door, when the resident manager made her rounds, she would use her key to unlock them, just to check on you. Then she would lock it again. But, this was not the resident manager. And this woman, she was so freaked out, she wanted to move immediately. She wanted them to move her from upstairs, where there were only maybe 2 or 3 residents, to downstairs where there were, but there was no room down there at the time, She was not the only person who had heard something like it. She was just the one who said it out loud. A lot of women heard those things and they would just, poo-poo it, I guess. Thinking it was one of the, kids. But the kids would be in bed. They had to go to bed at a certain time, like 8 o'clock. This was, building full of women and children who had learned to stay quiet about things that frightened them because saying it out loud took something. And we stayed about 3 months, and then we moved out. We found a place and we got out of there. We were glad to go. And I hold that gladness carefully because being glad to leave a domestic violence shelter is a complicated thing. It means you have somewhere to go, but not everyone does. And what I took from that building wasn't just the paranormal experiences. It was the understanding that history doesn't vacate a space when the people who made it are gone. That building had held the elderly and the dying and the left behind, objects of finished lives. And then it had helped women in crisis, children with them, women and children rebuilding, women and children trying to find a way back to something safe. 2 different populations of humans suffering layered on top of each other inside the same walls. Whatever remained in that building had witnessed all of it. The slow decline of the assisted living residents, the fear and the grief and the particular courage of the shelter residents. It had walked the halls through both eras, checking, watching, making its rounds in the dark. I don't know if it meant harm. I'm not sure it was capable of meaning anything in the way we mean things. I think it was simply there, persistent, habitual. The ghost of a routine that had outlasted every person who once gave it meaning. The cook felt it watching her, and the women and kids felt it in the bathrooms. I felt it in the basement. My mother felt it at the door. Another resident heard it dragging itself down the hall in the middle of the night. We felt it. We named it to each other quietly in the way that women in difficult circumstances share information, carefully without making a production of it, because there were already enough things to survive. Now, this is the last episode of What Lived With Me, for now. Couple of places. A teenager's house where something called my name. A dead man's home where his presence, where that dark entity never left. Nearly 3 years inside a place that wore us down piece by piece and finally looked back at me from a mirror. In this building where the ghosts of the old and the grief of the present occupied the same space, walking the same halls, checking on the people inside. Whew. It's just crazy. It's really crazy. You know, I've been asked in my life whether I believe in these things, whether I think what I experienced was real. And my answer is always the same. I don't require your belief. I'm not here to convert anyone. I'm here to tell you what happened to me as clearly and as honestly as I can and let you decide what to do with that information. What I know is this: the voice called my name and I heard it. I felt those things in that house. The figure stood on the landing. My fiance saw it. And that face in the mirror was not mine. And those voices were not his. The footsteps came down the hall and no one was walking. These things happened in these places, and to me, and to people I was with, and to people I had no connection to before we found ourselves in the same building at the same moment. And the women in that shelter, them and the kids, I think about them sometimes. Think about all of them. The ones who were there when I was there, and I wonder who was there before and who came after us. They were already surviving something enormous. They deserved a building that let them rest and feel safe, and at a minimum in the physical sense within those walls. Hope they found that. I hope the ones who needed to get out got out. I hope that woman who's partly tried to, the leader, I hope she didn't go back to, I hope she's doing well. I hope the building, whatever it held, was gentle with those who came after us that it had any obligation to be. Some places hold more than they should. Some things stay past when they're welcomed, and some people, without asking for it, without deserving it, end up living alongside both. That's what lived with me.